Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to which is our seventh webinar of this academic year as part of our sort of King's Leadership Academy EdTech series. And very lucky this afternoon to have Mary Myatt with us. And she'll be going through this theme of sort of closing the gaps and the best bits. So in terms of the sort of process for this afternoon, as always, if you've joined us over the last sort of 7 different webinars, you'll know that if you've got any questions that you want to ask us. Okay, so if you have got any questions throughout the session, as we've done in the past, if you put those questions in the chat, I'll keep an eye on them for Mary, and then we'll have a bit of a question and answer session when we get to the end of the session. And we do have our EdTech mail, and you can sign up to our newsletter, which keeps up to date with sort of the approaches that we're taking as a school in terms of supporting that EdTech demonstration program. So we've talked about the Q&A and just a bit of context. So for the session in terms of where we're going, so we have a quick sort of introduction and welcome from myself and Mary. We are going to plan to finish around about 5 or just after 5. We're going to look at Mary delivering the main session, the question and answer session, as we said, and then we'll have the close. So as we said this afternoon, Mary's focusing on closing the gaps, sort of the best bits, and a bit of context about sort of King's Leadership Academy in Warrington. If this is the first time that you've joined us this afternoon for our session, in particular, during the main sort of lockdown from March, we moved to a complete remote sort of learning timetable for all pupils. So from March, from that initial lockdown right the way through till we broke up in July, all pupils had access to an online sort of remote curriculum and timetable in which they were having live lessons as they would have done if they were in school. And then we've advanced that further through our sort of EdTech program, and we've supported in terms of other schools and trusts in their sort of remote provision, and we've created a sort of like a comprehensive sort of hybrid sort of blended learning model since September, and that's enabled again that every pupil, even if they've been isolating, have been able to sort of have access to lessons as normal. Bit of context about myself. So I'm here as the trust lead. In January, I'm taking over as the EdTech lead for the school, and I've been teaching 13 years now. So this is my 13th academic year, probably the most difficult academic year, I would say, as probably we all are feeling at the moment. Mary and I sort of briefly mentioned that at the start when we came onto Zoom. Principal examiner role outside of the normal teaching timetable, and then authored Craft, which you may have heard of, and then more recently, which is due out on the 8th of January, which is the Feedback Pendulum. Then if you want to get in further contact with me via Twitter, you can do. There's the Twitter handle there. And if you want any further info about our sort of EdTech program, I'm more than happy to answer those questions. So I'm now going to hand over to Mary. She'll do a short introduction, and then she'll lead the session. As I said, if you've got any question and answers, please put them into the chat facility, and I'll keep those for the end for Mary. So over to you, Mary.
Yeah, okay.
That's it, we're on.
Right, so everyone taking care of themselves, headlines from research, ambitious. Is it moving on?
Yeah, it's all working now. That's perfect.
Right, so making sure it's ambitious. Children are saying that they like demanding work. Got plenty of examples from that, but I'm just going to summarize by saying that when we give children demanding work, they tend to say that they enjoy it, they relish it. I've got a number of examples from secondary, but I'm just going to underpin it by saying that it needs to be high challenge, demanding work, but underpinned by low threat. Quick example from primary, because I know there are primary and secondary colleagues on here. But in any case, I think that we take our insights from across phase. This is from Alison Peacock's work from 2015. She and a colleague were interviewing some children as they went from year 5 into year 6. asked them what they thought of ability tables, but actually the children are talking about the levels of challenge, and that's what I want to be unpicking in relation to tapping into the best bents. So when they talked to the children as they were going from year 5 to year 6 about what they thought of ability groups, the answers were astounding. The more able loved it. They enjoyed being the bright ones and having special challenges set by the teacher. The middle group were annoyed they didn't get the same work and challenges as the other group. They wanted to try harder work, but they'd worked out they'd never be moved up as there were only 6 seats on the top table. The less able were affected the most. They felt dumb, useless. They thought they'd never be allowed challenges as they usually work with a teaching assistant. This less able group liked the sound of some of the challenges the top group had, but they knew they would never get the chance. So if we're thinking about closing the gaps, we need to be mindful of the fact that we've got examples from here and elsewhere that children relish doing difficult, interesting work. This is also backed up by Peter Brown and colleagues' work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, making it stick. I've just got a few pointers from here as we think about putting those extra demands onto our children and thereby closing the gaps. So he and his colleagues have found that in order for learning to be secure, it needs to be we all need to put some effort into it. But we've got children saying that, they want to do difficult work. We've also got it from Dan Willingham. I think most people on this call are probably familiar with Why Don't Students Like School? So a few insights from that as we think about closing the gaps. Human beings are curious. Okay, so we tap into the idea that human beings are curious, but thinking is hard. It's meant to be. But we can tap that back to what children are saying, that they enjoy doing demanding work, they enjoy challenge. And let's just take a quick example when we're looking at demanding text. So this example is from history. It's from Richard Kennett. He is this brilliant historian and a senior leader across a trust in Bristol. And in this year 7 group, mixed prior attainment, they're learning about the Norman Conquest. So this is what he sets them for homework. He says, we tested out the scholarship reading homework with a year 7 group, guinea pig class. Every student can access it, even those with a reading age below 10. Clearly, we need to have higher expectations of these kids. Okay, so what they've got here for homework is they've got some reading to do from Mark Morris's account of the Norman Conquest. Okay, this is not dumbing down, this is challenging work. Mark Morris is a world-renowned historian, but interestingly, Richard says to them, your job for homework is to read this. Now, you're not going to understand it all, but that's all right, because if you can't answer all the questions, no, he goes on to say, this is supposed to be hard. If you can't answer all the questions, don't worry. What does he find? They all have a go at it. When I talked to Richard about this, I said, why are you offering your children this demanding work? And he said, well, I think they can cope, he said. But he said, in the lessons, when we're learning about the Norman Conquest, we are using extracts from Mark Morris's account of, Simon Shamer's account of the Norman Conquest. What I want my pupils understanding is that while there might be historical events that are uncontested, historians disagree about the significance of those. So taking children in really deep, mixed prior attainment, year 7, this would normally be A-level analysis that they're doing. They're obviously not producing work at that level, but he's taking them into that domain, really deepening their learning. If we're interested in closing the gaps, I think this is really helpful. A quick example from year 6. Here we've got Ashley Booth, brilliant on Twitter. Why does he love whole class reading so much? Because a child who would have long been considered low ability could access texts like The Caged Bird by Maya Angelou with their peers, and subsequently that great educational term, bang out stuff like this. So what we've got here is the child has clearly been supported, but it's their own voice coming through as they make the connections between the conditions for the bird trapped in the cage and for a large proportion of Black American society in the 50s and 60s. Very sensitive response, and of course, very live today. So what I'm arguing is that part of our emphasis on working smart in terms of closing gaps, taking some best bets, I think one of the threads is that we pitch it high. Again, from Dan Willingham, Our Brain's Privilege Story. This is incredibly helpful if we're looking to close gaps. We've also got it from Steven Pinker, world-renowned cognitive scientist. He said that cognitive psychology has shown that the mind best understands facts when they're woven into a conceptual fabric, such as a narrative, a mental map, or intuitive theory. Disconnected facts in the mind are like unlinked pages on the web. They might as well not exist. So if we're interested in closing gaps, we pay attention to stories and high-quality texts. This isn't about just novels. It's about high quality texts overall at every level. We've got Marianne Wolf's work, Proust and the Squid, the story and science of the reading brain. This is what she has to say. Human beings invented reading only a few thousand years ago. And with this invention, we rearranged the very organization of our brain, which in turn expanded the ways we were able to think, which altered the intellectual evolution of our species. So what I'm taking from this is that when we read, we become cleverer. But we need to pay attention. There's work to do. This report came out from Oxford University Press and the Centre for Education and Youth just a couple of weeks or so ago, bridging the word gap, which is significant between primary and secondary. Well worth taking a look at that. There is work to be done. It's not a blame game, but the expectations for academic language, particularly at secondary, is much higher. So how are we going to build in provision that is going to support all our children, but particularly those who might have wider gaps? We've got a reading deficit in this country. There's work to be done. Over 25% of children in 2019, the last year for which there was data, didn't reach the expected reading standards. So this is of concern if we are looking to close gaps. Research from the Department for Education from a few years ago found that only about 30% of children are read to daily at home. And then a teacher tap question a couple of years ago found that only 15% of Year 4 teachers read to their classes every day. All right, I think these might be related, colleagues, to why our children are not doing as well as they might. This is not to have a pop at primary teachers. I think this is system-wide, that we are not developing children's reading and vocabulary as we might, because I think we're missing some tricks. There are some barriers to reading. So we might have the evidence, such as it is from Willingham, from Pinker, from Wolf and others. So why aren't we using it in schools? Why aren't we reading more to children? Well, there's some barriers. First of all, it's enjoyable, right? So I'm inclined to think that if something is enjoyable as a professional, therefore can it be work, right? So this is a problem, but we've all had an experience where if we've read aloud to a class, sometimes the atmosphere changes and there's that, magical atmosphere, what Claire Seeley calls the collective cuddle. There's part of us thinking, how can something so enjoyable be work, which is an issue. Got to get over that. The second issue is time, that in two respects, actually. How much time will it have taken me to prepare for a lesson which is primarily going to be underpinned by high quality text? Well, I would have found a good book. I would have identified maybe half a dozen words that I either want to pre-teach or make sure that we talk about during the lesson. Okay, it won't have taken me that much time. What I've not done is work until midnight preparing half a dozen differentiated colored worksheets that are going to widen gaps. Right, so with some questions to ask ourselves about across the sector, I think there's an inclination to confuse activity with productivity. Right? And quite often, smarter ways of working, which are primarily we do in order to get better learning for our kids, actually take less time. But there's also an issue of time in schools. Haven't got time to do this. Right? Schools that are taking this seriously. Talking to a young science second in department in a big school in London. They read a minimum of 800 words every lesson. They make the time because they know the difference it makes. And then there's evidence. So one of the issues with evidence is that if someone comes into my classroom, what does it look as though is going on? Just looks as though the kids aren't doing anything. Okay, but they are. It's all happening internally. So, you know, as a sector, I think we're obsessed with making sure there's a written outcome every lesson, right? Why? Why are we writing before children have been properly fed through speaking, listening, and reading? Okay, I want to get decent outcomes. We need to be paying attention to the stuff that makes a difference rather than going through some proxies. I'm not saying we don't get written work, but I'm saying it will be better quality if we're not obsessing about having something to prove to other people that our lesson has taken place. So I'm going to share now some research that came out of Sussex University a couple of years or so ago, the faster reading research, where they found that simply reading challenging novels, complex novels, allowed and at a fast pace at each lesson repositioned poorer readers as good readers, giving them a more engaged, uninterrupted reading experience over a sustained period. So just a few headlines of what happened in this trial. So the schools that took part, they selected 2 novels that were at least a year above what the students would normally be studying. So this pitching it above their pay grade. That's all they did for 12 weeks. Okay, so no expectation for any written work, might have made a few notes. That's all they did for 12 weeks. It wasn't a huge trial. There were 365 year 8s. And what did they find after those 12 weeks? Well, the overall reading ages had improved by 8.5 months. What did they find for the poorer readers? Almost double, 16 months progress they made. Now, I just don't think we can afford to ignore this kind of evidence. I've got a lot of colleagues saying, well, I'm not in English. Well, there's literacy across the curriculum applies to every single subject. It's not just the domain of literacy in primary or English in secondary. So the question for me, with a background in RE, I'm thinking, how am I going to incorporate the insights into my lessons that are going to have a significant impact? So I might not do something for 12 weeks. On the other hand, I might. Why not? At key stage 3, what have I got to lose? But for me, this is important research. If we're serious about closing the gaps, this applies to primary, it applies to secondary. And I think we've got to take the development of reading really seriously. So there's a report that goes with this. I shall include it in the links I send over. And 2 things really struck me from the report. One was that when they spoke to the pupils who've been identified as poorer readers about why they'd done so well, what was going on, they said, well, we don't normally get the chance to do this sort of level of reading. Right? We're interested in the best bets for closing gaps. Why are we denying children opportunities to get there? Because what's the diet for a lot of our struggling pupils in whatever domain? Well, I'll just take English for an example. It tends to be their diet is one of phonics, of decoding, of SPAG, and of leveled readers. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those, but if they don't get anything else, how are they ever going to catch up? But then they went on to say, they said, well, we didn't need to understand every word. We were able to get into the gist of the story because we were able to talk about what we did and didn't understand. That made us want to carry on. So it shifts the motivation from external to internal. When we've got intrinsic motivation, our children are going to want to carry on. And that's the place that we want to take them to. If we're interested in closing gaps, this for me is one of the biggest bets. Critical thing is they felt successful early on. All right. And David Daida's very good on this. This is, if we're going to pitch it high, children must feel successful early on so that they don't flounder. The other thing that came out of the research was that when they talked to the teachers about why they'd done so well, what they thought was going on, well, they were surprised. They didn't think they could cope. Right. Now, as a sector, I think we're inclined to think that too many of our children can't cope. We're interested in closing gaps. We have to assume that they can cope, particularly with support. So why a story is so important. And as I say, I'm including high quality texts of all types, okay, that I think should be underpinning our provision in every subject. Okay, well, they provide a big picture. So we know with the focus on the curriculum that the background knowledge, the hinterland, as Christine Council calls it, very, very helpful lens through which to look at what we're offering our children. They need some background. High quality texts can do this. They contain complex ideas. They often contain the concepts which we know are very important. They enrich children's vocabulary because the written word is generally more sophisticated than the spoken word. You're going to find more tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary within a written text. And we're all obsessed with developing that in our children. Most efficient way to do it is through a high quality text. And then, as we've seen, it's inclusive for all, right? So what might we do then on the back of that? Well, I'm going to suggest that we just underpin as much of our curriculum as possible, particularly when we're working on new units, with high quality texts. Okay, because I just don't think we can afford to ignore this evidence. So I've just got a quick selection here, which are across primary and secondary. Wonderful one here for Darwin and the Origin of Species, upper Key Stage 2. But actually, I've heard of people using this as low as Key Stage 1. Sabina Radeva, trained as a scientist, retrained as an artist. Fabulous stuff, full of rich language. Misconceptions, very helpful for any teacher like me without a background in science. If I'm teaching this, I've got some pointers there. Great Fire of London, often a Key Stage 1 text or topic. You know, beaming this through a whiteboard, children just looking at these lovely images, teacher reading. Okay, this is a suggestion from Andrew Percival, where they developed a unit around this, took the big words and the concepts out and made sure that those were taught to children, also put it into a knowledge organizer. Some geography, Michael Moore-Pergo's Running Wild, some high quality non-fiction texts, Sapiens. So quite often people say, oh, there isn't anything in science. My goodness, there is. So plenty of schools are taking extracts from Yuval Harari's Sapiens and offering this either in lessons or for homework. This is great homework extracts for this. Richard Feynman's 6 Easy Pieces, absolutely brilliant, just so clear. And then this is even easier, Carlo Rovelli's 7 Brief Lessons on Physics. I mean, this is just joyful stuff. Why wouldn't we want to offer it to our children? Michael Palin for geography. This is helpful, written as a diary that starts taking children into new territories. And then Ben Rogers' work on the big ideas in physics. Got some great stuff out there. This could be good for RE, Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe. Some high quality non-fiction. Gombrich's is great, Little History of the World, written about 60 years or so ago as a primer for undergraduates. But I've done work with it at Key Stage 3, and I've also know colleagues using it at Year 5, because high quality material can go cross phases. Someone on Twitter, I need to find who it was to give them credit, suggested this, and I bought it. Ian Baruma's work, Year 0. This is a brilliant book on 1945, right at the end of the war, and just unbelievable. But they suggested it as background reading for an Inspector Calls, because of course Priestley was writing, just a few years after the war. This would be great for PSHE, RE, English, probably get some interesting geography as well. This is Amanda Cozy McQuartie's work. She's the CEO of the Chartered, of the Christian Aid. Came out a few months or so ago. But where are you really from? Okay, we want to offer our children these interesting texts. So just a handful more. There's Bill. This is a wonderful book, History of Art in Pictures, Hockney. Maths, I could go on, and there's some wonderful stuff in Latin as well, Lorna Robinson's work. Here we've got Ovid, who's going to teach us about the metamorphoses. You'll be relieved to hear, colleagues, we don't have time to do any translations, so I've skipped that bit. So that is my way of arguing that that element of research can feed into our understanding of some strategies we might use, I would say, not might use, I think we ought to be using in order to close the gaps. Then to consolidate that, Alex Quigley's great work, Closing the Vocabulary Gap, Reading Gap, Isabel Beck's Bringing Words to Life, Amazing Strategies for Consolidating Reading and Language Development. And I recently come across this, which is Julia Strong and Pi Corbett's work, Transforming Learning Across the Curriculum from Upper Primary to Sixth Form. I thought, I can't believe that is having that. How can that happen? I've got the book. It is quite amazing. So where it takes the reading and the vocabulary development and then transforms it into writing structures, it is beyond belief across all subjects and key stage, upper key stage 2 to key stage 5. Very impressive. I think every school ought to have one. Okay, taking this really quickly, apologies. Peter Brown's work, again, making it stick. What they found was that the spaced repetition, I think this is now becoming commonly understood, interleaving of different but related topics tends to deepen learning. All right, so a quick example here from Dan Willingham from a few years ago, where he talks about a pre-registered randomized control trial of interleaved as opposed to blocked practice for 4 months in 54 7th grade maths classes. So they're about 12, 13, and impressive results on unannounced tests a month later. So just the headlines from this is a very good research paper that goes with it, which I'll include in the links I send over. But what they found was that when material is interleaved, it leads to higher test scores. So the tendency within the sector is to block teach. Okay, so I teach it in a block, we assess it, pile of numbers go into some spreadsheet, never to be seen again. Why? Anyway, so, and then we move on to the next one. Okay, and because we kind of parked the first one, tick, done it. But actually, what is better for learning, particularly if we're interested in closing gaps, is making sure that we're drawing in material from earlier points. Okay, it explains it very well. There's plenty of material out there. It needs careful thinking. It's not about jumbling stuff up. It's about being very intentional about this. But what they found was that when children were tested a day later on their maths, you can see that the children who'd had the interleaved practice, they got 80% correct, compared with the blocked practice only got 64%. But look what happens a month later. So it drops for the interleaved, but not by much, but see how much it's dropped for the blocked practice. And these kinds of findings are being replicated. I don't think we can afford to ignore this if we're interested in best bets for closing gaps. Interestingly, on the paper, it talks about workload. It said, actually, this is not more workload for teachers. Great, because I don't think any of us needs to work any harder. What they said was, this is about just thinking about, it's just about planning slightly differently. So it's the same material, but it's how we draw in elements that children will have covered before, been taught before, so that we keep it fresh. So big studies and plenty of resources out there to support this. Just want to say a few words about implementation. If we're thinking about closing gaps, the best bets for closing the gaps. I don't have time to go through all of it because I need to stop I think in a few minutes. I've just pulled up some of the elements within the implementation bit of the quality of education judgment, just to highlight, not in terms of playing to any external agenda, but actually in terms of what might help us to close some of those gaps. Just quickly here, good subject knowledge. We all need to develop our subject knowledge. Nobody's got it taped. It's a big issue of primary because of well, all sorts of reasons. We know why, don't we? It's never a blame game, but it goes on to say that leaders have put in place appropriate support. Marvelous. So we all need a bit of time. It talks about helping pupils to understand the key concepts. So we know that learning is deeper if they're taught the deep concepts, and discussion. Basically, we don't talk enough in classrooms. High quality talk. School 21's got some great stuff on that. I don't have time to go into it now, but I'm just going to pick up on the best bets from the cognitive science in terms of closing some of those gaps. So Dylan William and his colleagues have found that, if children understand concepts, their learning is likely to be deeper. So one of the things we can do is make sure that we're identifying the concepts or the big ideas. Why? Because these act as kind of holding baskets for lots of information. So if I understand a concept, it means that new information is much stickier. Okay, so this is both an efficient way of working because there's plenty of concepts, but there aren't too many, but it makes our planning easier to spot those links over units over time. But it's important for all of us, including our children. So the concepts are quite often are big words. They're often tier 3 vocabulary. So we've got an opportunity here to deepen children's learning in a way that doesn't cost us very much in terms of time. And we're all very keen to develop that, aren't we? So I think that there's some opportunities to go into the etymology or the roots of the words in order to deepen children's learning, because this is what this is all about. And so I don't have time to do all of these, but I would just say that if a child knows that an isosceles triangle comes from the Greek, isos is scary, so isos is equal, skeles is legs, they've got a bigger mental model of what an isosceles triangle is. This is taking them in deeper. We can set this up for homework. What a shame it is that so many children are telling me that they don't enjoy maths in secondary. What a crying shame. And when it turns out that it's algebra, maths is brilliant. So what's going wrong? And they say they don't get algebra. They don't know why they're learning algebra. So what difference would it make if they knew that the word algebra came from the Arabic via the Greek, and it means the balancing out of unknown quantities? This would really deepen their learning. Very quick, what's the name task, homework tasks, which don't need to go on a spreadsheet. Just ask them. Sometimes people say this is too difficult, but, children like doing difficult stuff. But also got children at the age of 4 who are fluent in dinosaurs, haven't we? A lot of those children know that the word dinosaur comes from 2 Greek words. Dinos is scary and sauros is lizard. So I'm just going to wrap this up here and just say that we can consolidate some of what we've talked about by identifying the big concepts, underpinning it with a story, but just to show how we can deepen children's learning once we've created something like a knowledge organizer. It breaks my heart when I hear of them and see them being created, stuck in kids' folders or books, and they're never used. What a waste of time. We've got to extract the value out of them because, we're interested here in what makes a difference to closing those gaps. This is from History Year 7 on a Part 8 from Michaela School, and great opportunities here for etymological work. Just get the children for homework, just finding out 3 or 4 of where these are. Low stakes quizzes next day, really squeezing this out and doing that again over time. Some common Latin roots, Greek roots that can help us. And so colleagues, I think I am going to be calling it to a close there and just wrap it up by this bit by saying, if we want to have a real handle on the best bets, it's about taking the findings from cognitive science and saying, is this applicable in my context? How am I going to use it in a way that's going to really make a difference to my children? But also, we're going to find it's going to save us time. So just in order to make that time, we need to be thinking hard at some of the things that are getting in the way. So that I'm thinking of marking, I'm thinking of dodgy data, and I'm thinking of how we use our meetings. But colleagues, I'm just going to pause there so we can take a few questions, if that's okay, Michael.